There's a lake in South America that the locals have called the birthplace of the sun for over 1,000 years. And right now it is quietly disappearing in front of the people who live beside it. Not in a flood, not in an earthquake, not in a single dramatic night that makes the evening news. It is vanishing slowly, inch by inch, season by season, and almost nobody outside Peru and Bolivia has noticed. But here's the part that should stop you cold. As the water pulls back, it is not leaving behind empty mud and dead fish. It is leaving behind stone walls, sunken platforms, ceremonial offerings, and the outlines of a civilization that vanished 1,000 years ago without anyone ever writing down why. Read that again. A lake that has hidden secrets since before the Inca Empire Eve, and existed is finally being forced, by drought, by heat, by decades of human pressure, to give those secrets back. And the people pulling them out of the water are not treasure hunters. They are archaeologists who thought they already understood this place until the lake started talking. Lake Titicaca sits at roughly 3,800 meters above sea level, high in the Andes, straddling the border between Peru and Bolivia, and it carries a title that sounds almost like a boast: the highest navigable lake on Earth. For the Inca, this was not just a lake. According to their own origin stories, this was the place where the sun god Inti and his children emerged to bring civilization to humanity. Long before the Inca ever arrived, though, another society had already built an empire on these shores, a culture called Tiwanaku, which rose to dominance roughly between 500 and 1000 CE, and is considered by archaeologists to be one of the true foundational civilizations of the Andes, a precursor to everything the Inca would later become. Tiwanaku built monumental architecture, organized complex trade networks across brutal mountain terrain, and then, according to the historical record, it simply collapsed. Around 1000 CE, the civilization that had dominated this entire region fell apart, and by the time the Inca rose to conquer the Andes centuries later, Tiwanaku was already a ruin, already a memory, already a mystery nobody could fully explain. That mystery has sat at the bottom of human curiosity for centuries, and now the lake itself may be the one finally answering it. Here is where the story actually begins to move. For decades, scientists have understood that Lake Titicaca's water level rises and falls in natural seasonal cycles. Water levels peak between March and May, and they bottom out between November and January, lagging a few months behind the rainy season up on the Bolivian Altiplano. That much is normal. That much has been happening for thousands of years, long before any human ever built a dam or diverted a stream. But what is happening to the lake right now is not normal. According to recent hydrological research, a measurable share of Titicaca's water level swings can be explained by ordinary climate variability, natural ups and downs, tied to rainfall and evaporation patterns that have always existed. That is the baseline. That is the explanation that should be reassuring. But here's where it gets worse. On top of that natural baseline, something else is happening, something layered on top of the ancient rhythm of the lake. A slow, grinding, cumulative decline that is not resetting itself the way it used to. Think about what that means for a lake this size. Titicaca is enormous. It straddles 2 countries. It supplies drinking water to millions of people across the Peruvian and Bolivian highlands. It is not some small pond that can dry up and refill in a season. When a lake of this scale starts losing water faster than its natural cycle can replace it, you are not looking at a weather story anymore. You are looking at a slow-motion transformation of an entire region's water system. And the consequences of that transformation do not stay contained to fish populations and tourist boats. They reach into agriculture, into drinking water security, into the survival of species that exist nowhere else on the planet, and into the fragile economic balance of communities who have depended on this lake since before written history. According to scientific assessments published in recent years, the glaciers surrounding Lake Titicaca have been retreating, and that retreat has measurably reduced the seasonal meltwater that has historically fed into the lake's basin. Less ice in the mountains means less water flowing down into Titicaca during the months when the lake would normally be replenished. At the same time, the region has been hit by a series of intensified droughts, some of them worsened by El Niño weather patterns, and those droughts have not been gentle. In some years, the lake's level has dropped by as much as 60 centimeters in a single season. Stack those years on top of each other, and by 2025, researchers have documented a cumulative drop exceeding 2 meters below the lake's historical baseline levels. 2 meters. On a lake this vast, that number sounds small until you understand what it actually exposes. Kilometers of newly bare shoreline, sediment that has not seen open air in centuries, and ecosystems that depend on stable water levels to survive at all. And this is where everything changes, because the casualties of this decline are not abstract. The Titicaca water frog and the Titicaca grebe, a flightless bird found almost nowhere else on Earth, depend entirely on the lake's reed beds and shallow water habitats to survive. According to population studies, the grebe's numbers have declined by more than 70% since surveys began in the early 2000s. That is not a gradual dip. That is a population collapse happening in real time in a place most of the world has never heard of, to a species most of the world will never see. When a habitat shrinks, when shorelines retreat, when shallow water that took centuries to stabilize suddenly becomes dry mud, the species that adapted to those exact conditions over thousands of years do not have decades to adjust. They simply disappear. And the scientists studying Titicaca are now raising a possibility that should sound almost unbelievable for a lake of this size. Under certain modeling scenarios, if current precipitation and evaporation trends continue, parts of the lake basin could face further declines of 1 to 3 meters by the middle of this century. Some researchers are even examining whether Titicaca could be inching toward what hydrologists call a terminal lake state, a basin where water flows in but increasingly struggles to flow back out in balance, slowly tipping the entire system toward a more closed, more fragile equilibrium. But here's where the story stops being only about climate and starts being about something far stranger. Because as the water retreats, it is not just exposing mud, it is exposing the past. According to researchers who have spent years diving into Titicaca's depths, the lakebed already contains submerged ruins tied to pre-Columbian societies, structures lying at depths ranging from roughly 5 to 20 meters underwater, with some artifacts found even deeper, down toward 30 meters. Near a site known as the Koa Reef, divers have documented what appears to be a temple complex sitting just a few meters below the surface. Expeditions into these waters require coordination with both Bolivia's Ministry of Cultures and Peru's National Institute of Culture, because what lies beneath Titicaca is not just historically interesting. It is sacred, contested, and in some cases barely understood even by the researchers who have spent careers studying it. For years, these underwater sites have only been accessible through expensive, technical, permit-heavy diving expeditions. The lake guarded its secrets well, but droughts do not respect permits. Falling water does not ask permission. And as the shoreline keeps retreating, what once required scuba gear and government clearance is increasingly becoming visible from dry land. Now, here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you, because while the world's attention was fixed on the slow disaster of the shrinking lake, archaeologists working not in the lake itself, but in the highlands, roughly 215 kilometers southeast of the ancient Tiwanaku heartland, uncovered something that nobody expected to find at all. In research published in the summer of 2025 in the journal Antiquity, a team led by Pennsylvania State University archaeologist Jose Capriles, working in partnership with Bolivian researchers, announced the discovery of a previously unknown temple complex they named Palaspada, after the local indigenous name for the area. This was not some minor footnote. This was a structure roughly 125 meters long and 145 meters wide, about the size of an entire city block, sitting quietly on a hilltop that local indigenous farmers had walked past for generations, without anyone realizing what was buried beneath the surface features of the land. Think about that for a second. A temple the size of a city block, hidden in plain sight, known to local farmers simply as a hill, while archaeologists searched elsewhere for clues about a civilization that vanished 1,000 years ago. The real story is that nobody found this by accident, and nobody found it by digging randomly into the ground. The research team used satellite imagery and drone-based aerial photography to first detect faint surface irregularities, stone alignments barely visible from the ground but unmistakable from above. Then they applied a technique called photogrammetry, stitching together thousands of aerial images to digitally reconstruct the site's true shape, revealing 15 separate quadrangular enclosures arranged around a central sunken courtyard. Each of those enclosures measured between roughly 360 and 600 square meters. The complex was built using a combination of red sandstone and polished white quartzite, and crucially, the structure's main doorway and overall layout were precisely aligned to the solar equinox, meaning this was not just a building, it was a calendar, it was a religious instrument. It was political architecture engineered by people who understood astronomy well enough to encode it permanently into stone. And this is where most people stop paying attention, assuming this is simply another old ruin in a long list of old ruins. But here's where it gets worse, in the best possible way for our understanding of history, and worse in the sense that it forces a complete rethink of how powerful Tiwanaku really was. According to Capriles and his team, charcoal recovered from occupation layers at the site brackets the most intensive period of use at Palaspada, to somewhere between roughly 630 and 950 CE, squarely within the era when Tiwanaku was aggressively expanding its influence far beyond its core territory near the lake. The temple's location was not random. It sat at a strategic crossroads, connecting three radically different ecological zones: the fertile highlands surrounding Titicaca to the north, the harsh llama herding plains of the Altiplano to the west, and the agriculturally rich valleys of Cochabamba to the east. Whoever controlled this junction did not just control trade in goods. They controlled the movement of ideas, of rituals, of political loyalty between three entirely different worlds. According to Capriles, the placement of Palaespada reveals something researchers had not fully appreciated about how Tiwanaku actually operated. This was not simply a temple for worship sitting passively in the landscape. It functioned as what the research team calls a gateway node, a deliberately engineered outpost that fused religious authority, economic control, and political power into a single physical structure. In Capril's own framing, the site functioned as a strategic control point that governed the flow of goods between regions, in an economic and political sense, while simultaneously asserting that control through religious legitimacy, which is exactly why the structure took the form of a temple rather than a fortress or a simple checkpoint. What most people are not seeing in this discovery is the sophistication behind it. This was not a primitive society stumbling into expansion. This was a civilization that understood, more than 1,000 years before modern political science gave it a name, that you do not need an army at every border if you can convince people that your authority is sanctioned by the sun itself. Authority does not stop at architecture. Archaeologists recovered numerous fragments of ceremonial drinking cups known as keru cups across the surface of the site, vessels traditionally used to drink chicha, a fermented maize beverage central to ritual feasting and agricultural celebrations throughout the Andes. Those fragments tell their own story. They suggest that Palaespada was not simply a place where political deals were quietly signed behind closed doors. It was a place of organized public ceremony, of shared ritual drinking, of feasts designed to bind distant communities to the will of a central authority through celebration rather than coercion. Read that again. A civilization that vanished 1,000 years ago was running a soft power campaign through architecture, astronomy, and ceremonial alcohol, and we are only now, in 2025, fully reconstructing how deliberate that strategy actually was. But here is where the bigger picture starts to come into focus, because the discovery of Palaespada and the slow draining of Lake Titicaca are not two separate stories happening to coincide in the same region. They are connected by the same underlying force, water. According to long-term paleoclimate research, PE, published in recent years, Titicaca's water level has never been static across human history. Scientific reconstructions using sediment cores and stable isotope analysis show that during the mid-Holocene period, thousands of years before Tiwanaku ever existed, the lake's water level dropped by as much as 85 meters in its deep basin, desiccating much of the shallower portions of the lake entirely. Century. Years later, the lake's level rose rapidly, climbing roughly 15 meters in a relatively short span, and continued rising in stages until it reached some of its highest recorded levels after the year 1600 CE. According to researchers studying this long-term record, the largest jumps in lake level coincided directly with major socio-political transformations recorded by archaeologists across the region. In other words, when the water moved dramatically, civilizations moved with it. Think about what that pattern actually implies. Tiwanaku rose to power during a relatively wetter, more stable climatic period that allowed for intensive, specialized agriculture and sustained population growth on a scale the region had never previously supported. The civilization did not simply appear out of nowhere. It was built on top of favorable water conditions that allowed food surpluses that allowed population density. IT and population density that allowed the kind of centralized religious and political authority capable of building something like Palaespada in the first place. And when researchers examine the broader collapse of Tiwanaku around 1000 CE, the timing lines up disturbingly well with documented periods of abrupt climate change and shifting water balances across the Andean altiplano. This is not chaos. This is a pattern. A civilization rises on stable water. A civilization falls when that water becomes unstable. And right now, in the present day, we are watching the same lake that built and broke Tiwanaku begin to shift again. Only this time, the instability is not being driven purely by natural climate cycles. According to current hydrological modeling, a meaningful portion of Titicaca's modern water balance is also being shaped by human water use, including irrigation withdrawals across the surrounding agricultural basin, layered on top of natural precipitation and evaporation patterns that were already under stress from glacial retreat. According to informed researchers studying this exact intersection, the most important variable determining Titicaca's water balance is the relationship between precipitation and evaporation across the basin, and that relationship is becoming less forgiving. Average evaporation ATEs across the lake basin now substantially exceed average precipitation, meaning the lake is structurally vulnerable to drying even before accounting for additional human withdrawal pressures or glacial decline. When researchers describe Titicaca's potential drift toward what is technically known as a terminal or endorheic condition, a state where the lake's outflow becomes increasingly relative to its inflow, They are describing something that has not happened to this lake within the time frame of recorded human civilization in the region. This would not simply be a dry season. This would be a fundamental shift in how the AHE entire basin functions, with consequences for drinking water, for agriculture, for fish stocks, for the Titicaca grebe and the Titicaca water frog, and for the milio ends of people across Peru and Bolivia who have never known a world without this lake at the center of their economy and their identity. And here's the layer almost nobody is talking about, the layer that turns this from an environmental story into something closer to a geopolitical one. Lake Titicaca is shared almost evenly between two sovereign nations, Peru and Bolivia, each with its own water policy, its own irrigation priorities, its own tourism economy built around the lake, and its own historical and cultural claims to the heritage sitting beneath its surface. When a shared natural resource of this scale begins to shrink, the question of who controls what, who is allowed to withdraw how much water for irrigation, who has jurisdiction over which submerged archaeological sites, and who bears responsibility for protecting endangered species living in increasingly fragmented habitat does not resolve itself quietly. According to current research, irrigation withdrawals already account for a meaningful share of the lake's water balance variability, separate from the natural climate-driven fluctuations. As that resource becomes scarcer, every percentage point of withdrawal becomes more contested, and every new archaeological discovery exposed by falling water becomes a question of cultural ownership between two nations that share a border running directly through sacred, ancient ground. This is where the slow becomes the sudden. Because while the surface story is glaciers melting and rainfall patterns shifting, the deeper story is about what happens to two nations, two economies, and dozens of indigenous communities when the central resource they have shared for over 1,000 years starts behaving in ways their ancestors never had to plan for. Tourism around Titicaca generates substantial income for both Peruvian and Bolivian communities living along its shores, built heavily around the lake's mystique, its sacred status in Inca cosmology, its floating reed islands, and now, increasingly, its archaeological revelations. A shrinking, increasingly fragile lake threatens that tourism economy at the exact moment that new discoveries like Palaspata are generating renewed international fascination with the region. According to those involved in promoting the discovery, local communities near Palaspata have explicitly framed the find as valuable for tourism and regional cultural pride, hoping the temple's documentation will draw visitors and investment into an area that has historically been overlooked. There is something almost unbearably tense about that. A region simultaneously losing its most famous natural resource to drought while gaining global attention for a temple built by people who themselves collapsed 1,000 years ago, possibly because of an eerily similar water crisis. What most people are not seeing is that this is not really two stories. It is one story told at two different speeds. The fast story is the temple. A single electrifying archaeological announcement that made international headlines for a few weeks in the summer of 2025, generated excited coverage from major outlets, and then faded from public attention the way most archaeology news eventually does. The slow story is the lake itself, grinding down meter by meter, year by year, generating almost no headlines at all because slow decline does not produce the kind of single dramatic image that captures global attention the way a freshly reconstructed sun temple does. But the slow story is the one that actually determines the future. Long after the excitement around Palaspata fades, the lake will still be there, still losing water, still exposing more of what it has hidden for centuries, and still forcing two nations to figure out how to manage. And this is where the uncertainty becomes impossible to ignore. According to the most recent modeling available, if current precipitation and evaporation trends persist under moderate warming scenarios, the lake basin could see further declines of 1 to 3 meters by the middle of this century. Stack that on top of the more than 2 meters order. Die lost relative to historical baselines, and you are looking at a transformation of Titicaca's physical geography within the lifetime of people alive today. That is not a hypothetical confined to a distant future generation. That is a shift that current archaeologists, current biologists, current Peruvian and de-Bolivian policymakers, and current indigenous communities living on the lake's reed islands will likely witness directly. Think about what that means for the floating islands themselves, built from totora reeds that depend on stable, shallow water conditions to remain buoyant and inhabitable. Think about what it means for fishing communities, whose entire livelihood depends on a lake ecosystem calibrated to water levels that have existed relatively unchanged for centuries. Think about what it means for a species like the Titicaca grebe, already down more than 70% from early 2000s population levels, facing a habitat that may continue shrinking for decades to come. The real story is that we are watching, in real time, the early stages of a process that has already happened once before in this exact basin, to the exact civilization whose temple just resurfaced in the headlines. Tiwanaku rose on stable water and collapsed when that stability broke. We do not yet know if the modern communities around Titicaca are looking at a similarly severe disruption, or whether modern engineering, modern water management, and modern international cooperation between Peru and Bolivia can do what ancient societies could not: adapt fast enough to outrun a shifting climate rather than be broken by it. According to current researchers, the uncertainty itself is the most honest answer available right now. The models offer ranges, not guarantees. The historical pattern offers a warning, not a prophecy. Titicaca has dried before and refilled before across thousands of years of natural variation. And it is entirely possible that current trends partially reverse if precipitation patterns shift back toward historical norms. But it is also possible that human-driven pressures, irrigation demand, glacial retreat that does not reverse on human timescales, and rising temperatures across the Altiplano push the lake into a genuinely new equilibrium that has no precedent in the entire span of human civilization in this region. What we do know with certainty is that the lake is still talking. Every meter it loses exposes more of what it has hidden: more submerged walls, more ceremonial sites, more evidence of a culture that built its identity, its economy, and its religion directly around the rhythm of this water. The Koa Reef Temple sits closer to the surface every year. The boundary between what requires a diving permit and what can simply be walked to on dry land keeps shifting in one direction. And on the highlands surrounding the lake, the discovery of Palaspata stands as a stark reminder that even after more than a century of serious archaeological study in this region, entire city block-sized temples can remain completely unrecognized, hiding in plain sight on a hillside, known only to local farmers as simply a hill, until satellites and drones finally tell researchers where to look. There's another layer to this that rarely makes it into the headlines, and it has to do with how scientists actually measure something as seemingly simple as a lake going down. You might assume this is straightforward. Less rain, more evaporation, water drops, end of story. But here's where it gets worse, because the actual hydrology is far messier and far more revealing than that. According to detailed water balance research published in the last several years, roughly 80% of the year-to-year fluctuations in Titicaca's water level can be attributed to natural climate variability alone, meaning the lake has always had a built-in rhythm of rising and falling tied to broader atmospheric patterns across the Pacific and the Andes. That leaves a smaller, but far more troubling percentage tied to something else entirely: people. According to those same assessments, irrigation withdrawals across the basin account for a measurable share of the lake's recent variability, separate from anything nature is doing on its own. Think about what that actually means. Even if the rain returned tomorrow to its historical averages, even if every glacier stopped retreating overnight, the lake would still be losing water to agricultural demand that did not exist at this scale a century ago. Nature did not create this entire crisis alone. Humanity is now a permanent variable in the equation, and that variable does not reverse itself the way a drought eventually might. The deeper research goes even further, and this is the part that should genuinely concern anyone paying attention to the long-term trajectory of this basin. A more recent and more detailed hydrological assessment found that precipitation and evaporation exert a far stronger control over the lake's water balance than either glacial meltwater or irrigation withdrawals. The average annual precipitation across the Titicaca Basin sits at roughly 744 millimeters, while annual evaporation losses run dramatically higher, somewhere in the range of 1,600 millimeters. Read that again. The lake is losing water to the sky at more than double the rate it is gaining water from the sky. That imbalance is not new. It has existed for a long time and is part of why the lake's level has always fluctuated. But as regional temperatures rise across the Andes, evaporation rates climb even further, widening a gap that was already structurally unfavorable. This is the mechanism quietly driving everything else. It is not a single bad year. It is not one unlucky drought. It is a basin where the fundamental physics of water loss are tilting further out of balance year after year in a direction that does not favor the lake's recovery. Now layer the human geography on top of that physics, because this is where the story stops being abstract and starts being personal for millions of people. The Bolivian Altiplano and the Peruvian highlands surrounding Titicaca are not wealthy regions. Many of the communities living along the lake's edge depend directly on subsistence agriculture, on llama and alpaca herding, and on small-scale fishing that has sustained families for generations. When irrigation becomes more critical to surviving increasingly unreliable rainfall, farmers pull more water from the same shrinking basin that feeds the lake, creating a feedback loop where drought drives higher water demand, and higher water demand accelerates the very decline that caused the drought-driven demand in the first place. This is the same agriculturally rich, ecologically fragile zone that Tiwanaku once depended on to feed a population large enough to build monuments like Palaspata. The techniques have changed. Modern irrigation channels have replaced ancient raised field agriculture. But the underlying vulnerability, A dense human population entirely dependent on a delicately balanced highland water system has not changed at all. What most people are not seeing is just how interconnected the trade and cultural network actually was that Tiwanaku built around this exact water system, and how directly that network's success depended on environmental stability that no longer exists in the same form today. According to the archaeological team behind the Palaspada discovery, the temple was not an isolated outpost. It was deliberately positioned to connect three radically different ecological and economic zones into a single centrally controlled system. The lake's fertile highlands, the high, cold altiplano above 3,700 meters where llama herding sustained long-distance trade caravans, and the warmer, agriculturally rich valleys of Cochabamba, where crops impossible to grow at extreme altitude could be cultivated and transported back. This was a civilization that had effectively built a redundancy system into its economy, hedging against the failure of any single ecological zone by maintaining controlled access to all three simultaneously. And this is where the punchline lands with real weight. That redundancy system still ultimately depended on enough stability across all three zones at once for trade routes, caravans, and seasonal agricultural cycles to function. When climate instability hit hard enough, broadly enough, and abruptly enough, even a deliberately diversified economic network built by one of the most sophisticated civilizations the Andes ever produced could not absorb the shock. The real story is that complexity and redundancy bought Tiwanaku time. It did not buy them permanence, and this brings us back to the diving expeditions still happening beneath Titicaca's surface today, because the underwater archaeology occurring right now adds yet another dimension to how seriously researchers are taking the connection between this lake's water and the civilizations that depended on it. The submerged structures near the Koa Reef, sitting at depths that have required formal permits, environmental clearance, and certified dive operators to access, are believed to be linked to ritual offerings and ceremonial practices tied to the lake's sacred status in pre-Columbian cosmology. Divers have recovered evidence suggesting these were not simply structures that fell into the lake by accident or erosion. They appear to have been deliberately placed in deep water as part of religious practices, offerings made directly into what ancient societies considered a living, sacred force, not just a geographic feature. Think about what that tells us about how seriously pre-Columbian Andean societies regarded this lake's power over their survival. They were not naive about their dependence on this water. They built religion, ritual, and sacrifice directly around an acknowledgement that the lake controlled their fate, centuries before modern hydrologists could quantify exactly why. So the question that remains is not whether Lake Titicaca has more secrets left to reveal. It clearly does. The question is, what kind of a world will be standing around it when those secrets finally surface? Whether the communities, the species, and the floating reed islands that depend on this lake's stability will still be there to witness what emerges, or whether the same slow water crisis that may have unraveled Tiwanaku 1,000 years ago is now quietly rewriting the future of everyone who calls these shores home. Tiwanaku never left behind an explanation for its own collapse. No written record, no final warning, nothing but stone, ceramic fragments, and a temple built to track the sun that someone, eventually, simply walked away from. If the water keeps retreating at its current pace, the next generation may not need archaeologists to uncover what happened here. They may simply need to watch it happen again, in real time, and ask themselves whether anyone was paying close enough attention to stop it.